My subject for this week is when the president proclaimed emancipation, could he keep the promise? There are many issues involved in that, but I put it in those very simple terms. In order to make a very basic point that is inherent in the kind of work I have done over a good many years as a student of public administration. In my way of defining a problem is that when something is declared as a policy, there are three steps or three levels about which we have to know something to get all the way down to the ground. First, there is the policy itself. Policy, to me, is an act of imagination. It is what whoever is designated as a policy maker, president, governor, king, bishop, pope, whomever, imagines the future will be. No one takes an action imagining that they will make the future worse. No one takes an action imagining that there will be of no consequence. They imagine that they're going to do something that they deem by their criteria useful. Obviously, they can be wrong. We all have that vision. There's policy. Policies, in my terms in public administration, get broken down into programs. You could use some other word, but I choose to use the word program. A level of specificity below the broadest, such as President Lincoln could proclaim that a certain number of people in some place as of a certain time would be and thereafter would be forever free. Very nice words. That is his imagination. Years ago, I saw a movie. I do not remember the title of the movie. I don't even know who the actors were. But a movie about something I think was taking place in some small town in Kansas, and I think it was in the movie set in a 19th century scene, when there was a little boy who was a nice little boy and very friendly with an older man. The older man was black, the little boy was white, and the older man was being given a hard time by some people in the town, or what I do not know now. And the little boy said to him, to this old man, Uncle so-and-so, that's not right, you're free. And the old man said, saying a good thing, don't make it so. That is, there's a concept, and you move to some level of specificity, and there's some program in between to get you there. And then there is the operational detail, the everyday stuff, to say that you will be fed. And does not get you anywhere if, when you become desperately hungry, there is no food and no way to get it. that you're entitled to be fed, let us say. And everybody says, but is there any food? No. Policy, program, operational detail. Let me illustrate again. I put my hands on a book very recently. In which I didn't prepare on this, I didn't go and look for it. I believe that the book is a biography of a man who was a provost marshal general under President Lincoln at the end of the war. I think that was so. In any event, it dealt with someone who had a plantation somewhere in the Deep South. The man knew about the Emancipation Proclamation. It was in effect. It was 1863. The war was by no means over. The city of Vicksburg did not fall until July of 1863. And this man took his property, the people under his control, his slaves, who were free under President Lincoln's order, and moved to Texas. That is, the proclamation could not be implemented, and that is the task. So I want to touch on some points that are in fact not well researched, not well studied, but everyone who is interested can make some effort to learn something about them. And I want to spend some time on some particular ones that help to dramatize one part of the argument. Number one, I want to mention for reference implementing emancipation through the military. The president issued an order applicable only under what he called the war power, applicable only in places that were in rebellion. And that depended, its implementation depended upon what the military did. There were, I have not gone back, there's a professor called Chandra Manning. I believe that is her name. An able young person whom I saw on C-SPAN or something like that very recently, talking about a new book that she's published. She was here at the University of Illinois, Springfield. No, she was here for the Abraham Lincoln Association last year, talking about her book, which was about letters that soldiers wrote home. And so she was talking about what soldiers said. I was saying in an informal conversation before this session began that soldiers do many things, wherever they are. They do many things that are illegal, contrary to orders, winked at by the commanders, and so on. And they do other things that are illegal, contrary to orders, that get them in trouble. They do things that are legal and under orders, all those things. But implementing emancipation through the military. Long after the president wrote out the executive order, the proclamation, the military had to do something. Now, take note, the president had already had to deal with generals who undertook to emancipate people earlier than he intended them to, or in the conditions that he didn't agree to. And so there was a general in South Carolina, and there was General Fremont in Missouri, and so on. That's one issue, one set of things that's worth knowing a great deal about. Any student, any teacher, any history buff who really wants to know something about the transition might pay close attention to that. Eric Foner, the historian of Columbia, had an op-ed piece in the New York Times last week or a week before. That is the first week of January or the second week of January, in which he commented on what he thought happened and what he thought did some good. Fona's name reaches so far that I got an email message last night from a friend that I've not seen for many years who teaches at Yale, and he was identifying his view with Fona's view. He doesn't know anything more about it, but Fona seems persuasive to him. But the role of the military is one part. There's another part of thinking about, could the president keep the promise? And the question is whether the promise is being kept in some other way. Amongst African American scholars in particular, there's a good deal of discussion at this stage of 2013 about self-emancipation, about people who leave where they are and go and do something else and asserting their own freedom. That is a subject on which someone should do some work at still another time. The third piece mentioned for further reference, although some part of it came up in a symposium for which I was responsible at the University of Illinois in October, and we will have access to some of that material, and I call it simply the high and the low politics of national decision-making in legislation and the Civil War amendments. For example, Richard Sobel at Northwestern University has done some serious work on the concepts that needed to be put into legislation that were not there in order to make emancipation fully effective for the people to whom it was supposed to apply. We may have an opportunity to deal more with some of Sobel's material. There is other material bearing on that, and of course, I referred earlier in another circumstance that says you cannot not take notice of Spielberg. That Spielberg's recent movie is about the 13th Amendment. And the 13th Amendment is the one that gives constitutional status to the freeing of the enslaved people. I should emphasize, for those who may not be fully immersed in what the 13th Amendment is about, is that the theory was that the president, having only marginally doubtful legal authority, might do things which some court later would overturn. It's very important to remember that the same court that reached the Dred Scott decision was still sitting and still claiming jurisdiction, and that there was litigation proceeding in the court, since everybody you had the right to make your legal claim, whatever it is, and that the court might say that this order issued by the president was null, void, and of no effect. That would have been very interesting and very confusing had it occurred. It did not occur. Just as we are here in real life in 2013, and we see various things being said in the mass media about what order the current president of the United States might choose to issue on the subject of gun control. And without taking any position on any of that, I mean, the same kinds of issues are presented again and again. Those are all things that should be taken note of. There is something else that's very important. Everyone should know that the United States is a federal system. Most people who had either a high school civics course that was good, or if they took Political Science 101, might well have come to understand the basic definition of centralized and federal systems. Centralized systems are where the national government has the authority to make decisions, and those decisions are carried out somewhere through the land. There are other systems where the national government does not have the authority to make decisions all the time, and that some subordinates, i.e. in this country, states. Australia has states. Canada, I guess, has provinces. And so there are some things that are federal authority and some things that are state authority. I mention that because, of course, once the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, then you came up with all kinds of state-level issues. There is a young scholar at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, whose name is Sally Heinzel. And she has written work. I think she's finishing a dissertation. It may be a book on the Illinois black laws. Illinois had laws. Illinois was not a state friendly to African Americans. There were African Americans present. I referred on a previous occasion to William Fleurville, but it was not a state friendly. All sorts of things happened, and and there were laws that restricted what people could do and when they could do it and so on, licenses they had to carry. And when, after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, Illinois suddenly repealed its black laws. The reason that that's interesting is that apparently at that moment Illinois had a Republican majority in the legislature, and the Republicans were the president's party, and whatever their motivations were, their action was compatible with what the president had just done. Illinois had characteristically been a Democratic state, and the Democrats were very antagonistic. I trust that we will see in due form Sally Heinzel's work out at some point. There are other aspects at the very same time. All this, remember, goes to the question of once the president has issued a proclamation, which is in effect a promise, can he see to its implementation, or can he keep his promise? And that was a serious issue during the life of the president and with regard to the president's decision after it was made. And so I say that one of the things that is noticed is that in the former Confederate states, state-level action amounted to a continual campaign to reassert some form of white supremacy, even though no one made the claim of maintaining slavery. And so there were in these states the so-called black codes. Black codes were things that told you when you had to work, where you could live, what your terms of dealing with your employers would be, and so on. And there were other struggles within states. And I want to move down and make some comment about two states in some little more detail. One of those states is Louisiana. One of those states is Mississippi. I don't mention them because they are oddities, but because they amplify the basic problem of whether or not the president's promises can be kept. And even the question of what do the president's promises mean? Specifically, in the Louisiana case, the President Lincoln, had some particular interest in Louisiana. The president did not get much of a chance to deal with any of this because, of course, he was killed. But just before he was killed, he issued instructions or advice. President Lincoln often used soft language for what people believe would be hard intentions. And so he wrote to a general named Nathan Banks. And Nathan Banks was, of course, there are those who would denounce him by describing him as a politician. He was a politician. To me, that's not a term of denunciation, but he had been Speaker of the House of Representatives and so forth. He had a commission as a general, and he was active in Louisiana. And the question was, whose side, amongst whites and blacks in Louisiana, whose side was he on, and so on. And similarly, there was a Michael Hahn, would-be governor, I suppose, in Louisiana, and the president was giving them his advice on who should be admitted to the franchise. This business of who was admitted to the franchise, i.e. who has the right to vote, was such a crucial issue in the minds of people involved. And amongst African American scholars, there's considerable hostility and criticism because President Lincoln said amongst the blacks that the vote should be extended or could be extended to the intelligent ones and those who have fought with us. Other people thought that was thought or do think that was a severe limitation and have a different view of that. The mythology, I do not think it's just proved, the mythology is that John Wilkes Booth, hearing that, says, that settles it. If he will let them vote, I will kill him. There are Civil War historians who take that account seriously, and they may be right, though I do not know who heard John Wilkes Booth say that and what the quality of the evidence is, but it is seriously believed by people who would be respected. In any event, in Louisiana, in the next few years, inside the first 10 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, the political controversy became very intense. And so I want to take just a little bit to describe one situation that produced a major Supreme Court case. The Supreme Court case is called U.S., that is United States versus Cruikshank, Cruikshank. And it refers to one parish. And I believe the parish is called Colfax. The parish for the rest of the world is the same as what the rest of the country calls a county. The terminology otherwise makes no difference. But Colfax Parish. And the events took place this way, the way they are described by one of the judges in the case. And that is, there was a posse comitatus. A posse comitatus, posse is spelled P-O-S-S-E, because nobody can, comitatus is C-O-M-A, comitatus, C-O-M-I-T-A. Yeah, go look it up. I'm messing that. I don't remember. When I write it correctly, but it is, the sheriff has the right to draft a volunteer group to help him in the enforcement of the law. This sheriff, there was a political controversy. It was a black-white political controversy. The sheriff was not black, and the sheriff pulled this posse. This is in 1873, coming up to around Easter. And so you had groups marching back and forth and in dispute. And they were in a building that took the place of a courthouse. It was apparently some farm building, but it served the legal purposes of a courthouse. There was a black group, and the white group in opposition to them managed to isolate them. and the group that managed to isolate them also managed to get some kind of artillery piece. Now, those who don't know about guns should know that an artillery piece is a big rifle. And so that a big rifle on wheels. And it will send a shot the distance of a rifle shot, but it's a big piece and will do a lot of damage. And so the group, the group is a private group, acquired this field artillery piece. They had other things, and they managed to conquer the group, the posse. Can the president's promise be enforced? The president is long gone. It is 10 years later. The world is going on. Can the president's promise be enforced? And so the answer is very simple. The trial judge read from a finding that described what happened. And what happened was that some number of people, the numbers do vary a little bit, but something like 30-some people who had taken shelter in this building. And the building was captured, and they were taken out one by one and were shot in the back of the head. Gang-style execution. There is a young woman called Leanna Keith, K-E-I-T-H, who's gone into some detail on this in a book that she published 3 or 4 years ago, and we've not been in recent touch, so I don't know how her book is doing. Furthermore, I don't know how her students enjoy this book. She was teaching in a high-class private high school in the New York area, and I do not know what she taught her students about this, but it was a very serious matter. That led to some trials in federal court and to some convictions. That led to an appeal, and the convictions were overturned. That is, the judgment of the court was that the particular statute on which they were convicted was either ill-applied or did not apply at all. As a practical matter, that then says that the people who had been told they were free if they managed not to offend their neighbors. They were free if their neighbors had bigger guns than they had. That was not an unusual pattern, only by the variations in the weaponry. Now, for those people who, students of Appomattox, you may remember that General Grant is alleged to have told General Lee that his soldiers could keep their horses because they would need them for the spring plowing. Indeed, I'm sure that the horses were needed for the spring plowing, though most plowing down south was done by mules, not horses. What the horses were really good for was what I have elsewhere called in writing the Confederate Army in civilian dress. Militias that operated throughout the countryside enforcing their will. And that is part of the answer to the question of, can a president's promise be kept? Let me switch. That was a case decided in, I suppose, the events in 1873. I don't really know offhand without consulting notes when the Cruikshank case was decided. About 1 year later, maybe a little bit later. It was along around November of 1874. There was a similar case in which I immersed myself somewhat, involving Warren County, Mississippi. Most everybody who pays any attention to the Lincoln administration and the Civil War is familiar with the Battle of Vicksburg. The Battle of Vicksburg, for those who have not gone to Vicksburg, Vicksburg is a city on hills way above the Mississippi River. Mississippi River runs past, it's a harbor. Way above the Mississippi River is this city on the hills. And of course, if you have guns, artillery pieces on the hills, then hardly anybody is going safely past you in a boat on the river. If you'll indulge me, if you're interested in the story, I will tell you two stories about this. One is, well, I'll tell you three and come back to the major point about this particular episode. Number one, when I was a child in Mississippi, I was a child in Mississippi at the time that the publicly operated, this is not lamentation, this is merely a recitation. I was in the 4th grade, and we got free textbooks in the school in which I had just enrolled. These free textbooks had been used before and were written because the books were recruited, had been written for use in the white high schools. That system in those days was segregated. And it was written, therefore, from a certain point of view. And I must say that I am amazed that I learned this passage, and I've never forgotten it. The passage referred to the siege of Vicksburg by the Union Army under the command of General Grant. And it said that for 47 days, the Yankee guns rained shot and shell upon the beleaguered city of Vicksburg, while elegant ladies in crinoline were reduced to eating mule meat and peas. They were indeed very short of things. But the point I usually make when I tell that story is to say that in telling any story, you have to deal with the sensibilities and the sensitivities of the audience. And so for the school children in Mississippi, their sympathies and emotions were supposed to be engaged on the side of the elegant ladies in crinoline who had been reduced to eating mule meat and peas. Whereas I will have to tell anyone who wants to know that my sympathies were on the other side. That is to be expected only under certain assumptions. That's the story. Not necessary, but I will pass on. The second is that it was of major importance, the military battle for Vicksburg, it was of major importance that Vicksburg should be conquered. Its defense was of major importance to President Davis of the Confederacy, and its crumbling was of major importance to President Lincoln. And it was a hard, hard task. These military tasks have their own insistence. And so Grant and General Sherman approached the city in a variety of ways, and they did not know how to get in. And so Grant went out of his way, went down the river on the Louisiana side, out of sight. By the way, in those days of communication, he was also out of communication with Washington. They weren't sure what happened, and here you get all the stories about Grant's drinking, and that's a part of it. So he went way down south and crossed the river and managed to come up behind Vicksburg, and in a 6-week campaign, managed to isolate the city and to sit there and lob shells in, and the city turned out to be a place of caves dug in the walls. And anybody who wants to might go to Vicksburg and see what the caves were like. Well, Vicksburg fell on July the 4th, 1863, which was a major, and the whole point was that there were two things that involved. This is from the military point. One was that commerce could flow up and down from Illinois to New Orleans, and no one knew that better than Abraham Lincoln of Illinois, who had himself been down the river as a young man twice, and there were lots of other people who knew the same thing. The second thing was that Vicksburg was also a place where material crossed from the west to the east in supporting the Confederacy. That being so, it was important. Now, I will now say that 10 years later, now in the 10 years, of course, many things happened. 10 years later, there was what I, having the military battle in mind, what I refer to as the political battle of Vicksburg. By the political battle, I mean a serious contention between two factions, one of which was black, with some white admixture possibly, and the other which was white. There are many things about this. If you were interested in this, Vicksburg was a place where, if you study American constitutional law, you will find a case known as Ex parte McCardle. McCardle was a Vicksburg editor who was a very outspoken man, and what he had to say was not satisfactory to the army that was then occupying Vicksburg. He was arrested, he was jailed, and so his case got to the Supreme Court, and so on, all sorts of things. In 1874, there was a political fight in Vicksburg, the county is Warren County, that is the model for what occurred the next year in the state of Mississippi, and which meant that politically the Confederate veterans took effective charge of Vicksburg government and of Mississippi government, which they were able to do so long as they did not violate the basic pledges to the United States. As long as they did not. And so, this is to my question here. Keep in mind the main question is, when a president's promise is made, can the president keep the promise? The president who made it, of course, was dead. But there is some president. The president who followed was Johnson, and the president who followed him then was Grant. Grant literally knew Vicksburg. He spent 6 weeks there trying to figure out how to get in. The question then was, there was a local sheriff. These local political matters get blown into very big games. There was a political sheriff, a local sheriff. Oh, I'm sorry, I should say, there was a governor named Ames, Delbert Ames. For those who are fans of John F. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy in Profiles of Courage has something to say about Delbert Ames, not favorably. Ames was the former general, New Englander, later a friend of John D. Rockefeller. At that time, the governor of Mississippi. He had also been a senator. And the local black people in Mississippi were on his side, or he was on their side, whichever the case may be. And they were in control of Warren County government at the moment. And actions were taken to force them out of office. The leader of that group went to see Ames all the way over in Jackson. Jackson these days by automobile is 30 miles on the highway. So I don't know how long it would take on a horse or on the railroad to get there in those days. Email didn't exist. Social media didn't exist. The telephone didn't exist for any, all right? So he had to go and see Ames, and Ames gave him whatever assurances he needed. He went back to Vicksburg and arranged his own posse. This is about a year after the episode in Colfax Parish. And his posse came from out in the country someplace to come into town, and there was again a series of fights. I've calculated the numbers very carefully, and it would not be convenient now to recite those numbers, but I can make them available. One can see what they are. And I use those numbers to describe, to convert, to use a concept that I thus far haven't found in anything that any of my colleagues may have written. I will get to it. And say we talk about such things as death rates. For my present purposes, I don't wish to talk about death rates. The death is, in fact, a result. But death occurs to everybody, and sooner or later, in some form. Instead, I talk about killing rates, just to make sure that we accentuate what is being done. And I do using the standard measure of what occurs per 1,000 of population. And I use, in regard to what happened in Warren County in 1874, after Sheriff Crosby goes and visits the governor must have said, there isn't much I can do for you physically. I can issue an order of some kind, but I don't have any help to give you. But you have the authority to go and do whatever is necessary in your best judgment. And he went and convened this posse to take back his office in the Vicksburg courthouse and to do whatever else went with that. And so the killings occurred. The killing rates, and I have 4 sources. One is from a distinguished historian named William C. Harris, who's alive and well and writing a good deal on President Lincoln. It was his dissertation book some years ago on Reconstruction in Mississippi. It's a big, thick book. It is a dull book unless you're deeply interested, but a big, thick book. The second author, Harris. The second author is a man called Edward C. Mays. Edward C. Mays had been Chancellor of the University of Mississippi, a distinguished lawyer, a man not given to exaggeration. He was then the son-in-law of Lucius Quintus Cincinnatus Lamar, the later United States Senator, later Supreme Court Justice. The third author was, I'm blocking on the name of the third author, and the fourth author was a man called Charles Furlong. Furlong was a New Yorker who'd gone to Mississippi, gotten involved in politics, had become sheriff of Warren County. I think he was sheriff just before Peter Crosby, and I've not been able to determine if Furlong and Crosby were direct antagonists. It is clear they were not on the same side, but all I have and I use Furlong because he also wrote a speech which he delivered in the state legislature, which I discovered a few months ago. And each of them gives some number of people killed in the second week of December 1874. Now, this is my Mississippi case. Colfax Parish is Louisiana. My point is that these local controversies are part of the question of whether a presidential order is in fact implemented or implementable, whether a promise given can be kept. Now, I'm sure there are lots of places in the world where that issue presents itself. And I will I will get close to the end by saying, in the Warren County case, in writing this up elsewhere, I have simply said the Warren County 1874 experience should be described. I do not mean to go to hyperbole. Should be described as massacre. The reason I say so is that the killing rates exceed any number. Now, not the numbers, the rates. The killing rates in Warren County at that time exceed those of 9/11. That the number of deaths per thousand population, number of killings per thousand population, no matter which source I credit, if I credit Mays as the most careful observer with the greatest incentive to not to exaggerate, I get a very high rate. If I use Professor Harris, a scholar many years later, not involved in this at all, he's literally dealing with what he found in the papers, and he has three sets of numbers. No matter which number I use, these are very high rates. If I use Furlong, who is very much a partisan in the matter and given to accentuating his own virtues and to criticizing the defects of his antagonists, his numbers are lower than some of Harris's numbers, higher than Mays's numbers, but they're all very high numbers. And so it says that there are times when a decision is made that the implementation of that decision is nowhere near the implication of the decision itself. That is, the question I ask is, when the president makes a promise, can the promise be kept? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. What then follows is that in the Mississippi case, if you go and do Civil War history, you will find references to what is called the Mississippi Plan. And the Mississippi Plan is a plan in which systematic, purposeful, organized violence is an important instrument in reasserting control by the people who had control before. I emphasize this because dealing with the emancipation question, there are other things that will also be said that are very important, but are, in my view, secondary. Now, this is because I have a certain analytical position on what is important and why not. You will find a book that is widely cited, published in the last few years, called Slavery by Another Name, or Slavery by Any Other Name. And my recollection is that that book is a book about two things. It is a book about the use of debt on uneducated plantation populations. I'm subject to correction if I'm in error on this, and if I'm in error, I'm sure that somebody will send me the right information. I invite that. The other thing that it reflects is the use of the civil prison system as a means of coercing uneducated laborers into subordinate ways in the world that are somewhere short of official slavery, but close enough. As important as those are, under my theory, they are less important, not unimportant, they are less important than the actual presence of violence understood as the gun behind the door no matter what. That then comes to the last little bit about this. In the Mississippi case, that leads us all the way down to 1890. Notice that 1874 is 11 years after the formal emancipation. 1873 in Louisiana is 10 years after. 1890 is 27 years after. And in this, you ask, what is the scale and level of emancipation? Well, I would note that under the laws that exist, in 1890, the voting population in Mississippi, the population legally entitled to vote, was male. Put the other issue aside. That population, given the demography of Mississippi, was 60% black. If you elect something of consequence, what result do you expect? To be concrete, in 1890, Mississippi elected a new convention to write a new constitution for the state. The Constitution had 134 delegates. If the voting population is 60% black, what share of that convention do you expect to be black? I don't know. You should, if you have any political wit, but don't know any of the present facts, you should be surprised if I tell you it was 133 to 1. You say, gee, if it's 133 to 1, that does not happen because people don't know how to mark a piece of paper. That happens because they live in a world in which they learn that there are some things to do to stay alive and other things to do if you are not all that anxious to stay alive. And that, think about the Emancipation Proclamation, the question is here. Notice that the third part of the subtitle for this series. The subtitle says, the Emancipation Proclamation, what happened before? What came before? Second piece, how did it work at the time? The third piece is, what happens thereafter? And so I say, 27 years thereafter, this is the Mississippi result. Is that to be expected precisely in that form any place else in the world? Probably not. One does not know how to make predictions with that degree of precision. But it is there something to be thought about in a serious and careful way, and I'm not sure that we have learned how to do that very well. Thank you.